Okay, and we're back, and this is lecture number 7, review session number 7, which will talk about the fractional reserve system for banks. Please don't get that confused. When we talk about fractional reserves, it's nothing, well, it has something to do, but it's entirely different than discussing the Federal Reserve. Fractional reserve system because we're talking about reserves the bank must put aside, and we'll see that they operate in terms of putting a fraction of total deposits aside as reserves. I'm going to use a graphical depiction of what goes on, and then we'll talk about the T accounts, and I'll try to do it a little bit slowly so you can see how to do this. In the last 2 years, I believe there's been one FRQ, one free response question that asks students to look at T accounts, but it is more common to make sure that students do understand the money multiplier, which depends upon what we're going to show. So starting off with the graphical depiction, let's imagine the following. Let's imagine that we have two assumptions. Assume that we're going to have $100 of deposits. And that'll be deposited into the system. So we get $100. Some depositor, someone's going to walk into a bank with brand new deposits. These can't be deposits that come from another bank. It must come from somehow outside the system. We will see that later on the Federal Reserve in the bonds market in New York City is creating money. So this new money comes into the system from outside the system. It's exogenous to the system, and it is a new deposit. In this case, we'll just imagine there's a depositor that comes from perhaps another country, has $100 of cash, has found this cash somewhere, and is going to make this deposit outside the system. It can't be coming from First Central Bank to the Second National Bank. That won't work. So we're going to assume there's $100 of new deposits, and that we have a system that requires banks to set aside some percentage of all deposits. This is a system that's designed to ensure and enhance the solvency of banks, to mitigate the effect of any sort of bank run that might excite or create anxiety in the depositors, which would then compel them all to show up at the same time to demand their funds at a speed and a pace that would outstrip the ability of the banks to have their monies. So in this case, we're going to imagine there's a fractional reserve system. Some percentage that can't be used for new loans has to be held at the bank, or really at the Federal Reserve, and this percentage will be 10%. So we're going to use this term called required reserves, and we'll express it as a percentage, 10%. So 10% of all new deposits will not be available for the bank to use as loans. What we got? So imagine we have $100 here. We'll put it in. Here's $100 new. And we're going to split this off each segment that we have with a possible deposit. We're going to have two different ways the bank will use the money. In one way, the money will be available for loan. We imagine the bank will loan it out. The second percentage is that part the bank has to hold. So for $100, if there's a 10% required reserve ratio, the bank will only be permitted, we're going to imagine that it does, in fact, do what it's permitted to do. It's going to lend out the maximum amount of money for which it's permitted to lend. So $90 goes out to be lent. Put dollar signs here just to make people happy. $90, $10. But $10 is down here. What's the $10? The $10 is the required reserves that the banking system compels this bank to hold aside. It will put this money on deposit with the Federal Reserve. Actual money will go off in a Brinks truck to some Federal Reserve system, and it will sit there and maybe get lent out and maybe shuffle about. But the Federal Reserve System will, in its own ledgers, identify this $10 as being held aside and not utilized by anyone. Now these $90 become available. We said $10 can't be used. If $10 can be used, then $90 can be used. So we have these $90 here, and they are available to lend out. And when we lend them out, we say, well, 10%, make the loan 10%, well, the $100 was deposited, $90 goes out a loan, the $90 is redeposited into the bank. Every time the bank makes a loan, the people receiving the loan hold it in the bank because they're not going to walk around with this money in their pockets. So when that money came back in, that was a new deposit. The new deposit, 10% of it had to go over here, but 90% of it became available for a new loan. And the new loan instantaneously becomes a deposit because as we lend money to people, they must put it somewhere. They probably would put it into a different bank. Perhaps I go to M&T and someone goes to Chevy Chase or they go to Wells Fargo. It doesn't really matter as long as all the banks are in the same system. And we can, for ease of understanding here, treat them as if they were one bank. It would work equally well if it's one bank or many banks in the same system. So here we have the system, $100, provided $90 for a loan that became a deposit. $90 as a deposit can be lent out 90% at $81, $9 held aside. These $81 are new deposits. They were the loan that became a deposit. And again, we have two different amounts. This is I'll put it here, 10%, and this is 10%. And this is the required reserve percentage. 10% of $81 is $8.10. And we have approximately $72 here. So, required reserves, this bank will have, after just 3 transactions, $27.10 of required reserves that may not be used for loans. Where are these $27.10? They're on the ledgers, the bookkeeping accounts, or the computerized program of the Federal Reserve. But the bank now has these loans that they've extended, and loans, we say, are an asset for the bank. An asset, they're a good thing, they're producing value over time. And the bank has 90 and 81, $171, $243 of loans. How does this happen? Is this some sort of alchemy? The person came in with $100, and now we're talking about $270-something of loans the bank has. From where did these come? They came from the fact that we're cycling these dollar bills through and around again into the banks. Every time the bank gets a dollar bill, a depositor walks in and says, "Here, please take my money." When the money comes into the bank can use some percentage of that, and typically it's the majority of that money, to use as in its business of loaning money, renting money, if you want to think of it that way. And it loans this money back out, and every time the money is loaned, the new borrower comes rattling back into a bank and deposits it. Really doesn't come back and forth. As people get loans, typically for businesses, they only get receipts of deposits made. So there's really no cash, it's just there's new pieces of paper. Piece of paper says, "We made a loan to you," and the loan is now deposited on your account somewhere. So it comes back into the system. And the moment it hits the system, the receiving bank can go and do this again. What does this mean? It means that over time, an initial deposit from outside the system, something that's exogenous to the system, can multiply through the system and increase the amount of deposits by some factor much larger, to make it a number much larger than the initial deposit. It's important to differentiate between what's going on here, which pertains to deposits, money that's sitting in accounts, and what happens when we talk about the total activity levels in the economy, when we get to the multiplier, which is actually talking about transactions, things being bought and sold. Here there's nothing bought or sold. This is people coming in saying and asking and receiving new loans, which become new deposits. And all of this, there's been no transaction, but there's an expansion of the money supply, and as we discussed in the review number 6, the money supply forms a basis that determines the total quantity of transactions that can occur in a society. We have an equation of exchange, which we looked at and we'll talk about again, which has ME equals PY, that the total amount of actual transaction in the economy is based on velocity and the amount of money in the economy. So this is the side we talked about the money. We're very quickly now going to transfer or translate this concept into T accounts. So there was the picture. that I hope explains and depicts exactly what goes on in the cycle of the multiple expansion of deposits. But in businesses, we have balance sheets, and you'll be required to understand this. Assets. This is liabilities. And I'm going to put this down here. And equity. Equity would be the accumulated profit and loss of this firm or an entity. We're going to just differentiate between things we can use that will be productive, and these are obligations, things we own, things we owe. These are obligations owed to someone else. These are things we own. And in our accounting system, there are two sides of every transaction. So look at this. We need to have just a few simple accounts to start. I'm going to put some accounts here that are really not on the AP, but I think they'll be helpful to explain this. So the first thing is we're going to say deposit. Someone walks into the bank and wants to make a deposit. For the bank, when it takes the money, it's creating an obligation to someday return that money. That's a liability, obligation. So we have here a deposit. Deposits are the bank's liability, and liabilities increase on the right-hand side. So this deposit here, we're going to go back to the $100. It increases the liability of deposit. Over here, well, this we call cash, cash reserves is the better term for it, and we'll put $100 here. So now we have it balanced. Left and right, always balanced. Here the reserves, the cash goes up by 100, and the obligation to pay it back at some future date goes up by $100. Now remember, we have a fractional system. A fractional system where only part of this deposit can be used. So I put reserves here, but we need to differentiate between two types of reserves. This is the step that really is not required in the AP. The AP wouldn't have reserves. We'd have two different accounts, and I'm going to move it to these two different accounts here. We're going to have something I'm going to call, I'll put it here first, the required reserves. And down here, we'll have excess or free reserves. Now, when you do this for the AP, you may have to have multiple steps in the transactions, and you'll have to have longer T accounts. I'm making these a little bit shorter because it's a review. It's limited by the size of the board, and we're about to be probably the limit of your attention span for one of these webcasts or videocasts. And then the last thing down here is we're going to put down another type of asset, and that's called a loan. A loan is an asset for the bank. And here we go. So what's the bank going to do? The bank gets the $100 reserves. At this point, the $100 sitting on the bank's accounts don't earn the bank any money. The bank only earns money by lending the money out and charging an interest rate. So it needs to get the money out of there. We know, we're going to assume again, let's assume still the same 10% required reserve ratio. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to put the $100 here, which eliminates this. Left and right are now equal. One minus the other, 0. So it's gone. There's nothing left in the reserve account. 100 minus 100 is 0. Where do we go? Well, we said we had to put 10% here. Excellent, 10. And 90 here. So what have we done? This is really what the step I'd like you to take on the AP. We've taken the $100 deposit and immediately differentiated it or allocated it between the required reserves, 10%, and the excess of free reserves, 90. The 90, you recall from the graph that I did, or the small depiction, the 90 is available to make loans. So let's go ahead and do that. We back it out by putting the 90 here. Left minus right, 0. There's nothing left there. And we'll put the loans down here. So, in review, we have the $100 obligation liability still there. However, this cash account, we've dealt with that by blowing it out, allocating it here between the two accounts, saying we have required reserves of 10. Fine, that's what we have to do. And there's no free reserves anymore, but we have no loan. So if we add up all the lefts and all the rights, we have 0 and 0, forget about those. 10 and 90 is 100 on the left, 100 on the right, and the balance sheet is balanced. That's how the bank allocates the monies it has. The next thing it would do, however, this is step number one, I hope you would write things like 1 and 1, and then actually, if you want, you write 2. I say this is all the first transaction. You might label it with more numbers for the AP, so you can describe what's going on. But I'm just going to say this is all the first round, the first step in the expansion of money supply. The second thing would be, well, this loan goes out here, and actually, this loan stays there, but that person who got the loan is going to go out to some bank, and we're going to assume it's the same bank or banking system, and put the $90 here. Aha! Now we're off and running in terms of the expansion of the money supply. This $90 we know goes over here. Where does it go? 10% of it goes here, and 90% goes here. That's 81. Now we're going to take the 81 out of it. This is your second transaction, and put it down here. So what do we do? The first thing was the deposit goes into required and excess reserves. Excess reserves can be used and are used to make loans. The loans are deposited. The deposits become extra reserves, and these free or excess reserves can be used as loans. This process can go, and we'll go through many iterations until this number eventually approaches 0, and then the process stops for that injection of $100. If someone takes money out of the system, this could be a question on the AP, takes something out of the system, all this reverses itself. Money disappears, loan disappears, reserves disappear, and you go the other way. It's a little more complex. I don't imagine you'd have to do this full thing for money going the other direction. It could, but it's very important that you are able to use T accounts to show what happens here. The final point of all this, if we go through all of these things, you'll then come up with this relationship. And the last point on this review session, this relationship works up to this finally. We get the money multiplier at this point in the review, we're just going to say what it is 1 divided by the required reserve ratio. Sometimes you'll see it written as RRR, or sometimes a small r. I don't think it matters. Just remember, required reserve, if you're on the AP, you might have a little note over here saying RR indicates required reserve ratio. If we do it specific to this point, 10%, we'll go back. We could use other percentages. If we do that, then let's apply it. This would equal 1 over 0.10, which is what 10% is, equals 10. That becomes the money multiplier. So if we were to ask what's the additional amount of the money supply, additional amount of expansion of money supply after deposit, or total expansion, slightly two different questions, we get the following. Initial, new means comes from outside the system, new deposit, times the money multiplier equals total expansion. And in this case, we had $100 times 10 equals $1,000. And this means that for this initial new deposit that came from outside the system, based on this number, we get a money multiplier of 10, means that that $100 would result in a total of $1,000 of expansion. If the question, this is important, if the question asks how much additional money is available in banks or on deposit in banks after the $100 or because of the $100, to say it's additional, it's the incremental, we would then have to back out the $100. Back out the $100. And the additional amount of deposits is $900. The total, including the 100, is $1,000. The additional is $900. Be careful to identify and be sure of the terminology that's used in the question on the AP, so you know whether it's asking whether the AP asks for the 1,000 total or the 900 incremental. That's about as much of this as I think you want right now. That's a little bit longer, almost 20 minutes. But it's the review, number 7, for the fractional reserve system. All of this is commonly, I can't guarantee it, but it's fairly common to have an AP question and a free response question that has some aspect of the fractional reserve system requires an understanding of how deposits expand in the bank.